Hello, class. We are continuing our lecture today on the book of Genesis, picking it up at chapter 12. And I just want to pull up my PowerPoint here so you can see what's going on. And the first thing I want to do is just remind you and kind of bring back to your memory the twofold purpose of the first 11 chapters, the first of which was to introduce the major characters of creation, which were, of course, God and humanity, and then also to help you understand that Genesis 3 through 11, that's what the first two chapters do anyway, introduce the major two characters. The second part is to present a clear picture of what has gone wrong with humanity or with the world in general with respect to sin. And so it explains why the world is the way it is. So remember that, how Genesis 1 through 11 sets up the next section, chapters 12 through 50. And we see a profound shift in focus where these chapters from 12 through 50 focus from the world to the history of just one family, which is, of course, Abraham and his descendants. And the time period that we're discussing, roughly these chapters cover events that happened between the years 2000 and 1550 BC, to give you a sense of where we are in terms of history. So let's jump into just a brief overview of these chapters. So starting with chapters 12 through 25, the focus there would be on Abraham and his son, Isaac. Now, in the first three verses of chapter 12, there's a powerful calling that God issues to Abram, as he's then known. And then I want to jump down to to chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. After facing a series of challenges, God reminds Abram of his promise. In fact, verse 6 in particular really focuses on that, because Abram's trust in God, and which is the fact that he is declared righteous by God, and this is consistent with some future verses in the Bible. And then we see in chapter 17 again, verses 1 through 6, a re-emphasis of the covenant promise that God has made to Abram. So I encourage you to focus in your, when you study Genesis, to focus on these few passages, because this will give you a really good handle on the nature of the promise that God has made and what that will mean for the people of God. Next, let's shift to something that happens in chapter 22, and starting with verse 1 and the double F means and verses following. The sacrifice of Isaac at Moriah. Now, that is one of those events in the Bible that you ask yourself, if I were in that situation, could I do something like that? And but Abraham demonstrates his utter and complete trust in God. It's again worth a closer look. But here's the common thread through each of these events that I want to highlight. All of these situations highlight God's promise and Abraham's obedience. You see that again and again in each of these passages and throughout this section of chapters 12 through 25. But now let's jump down to the rest of chapter 25, and go through chapter 36, where the focus is now on one of Isaac's sons, Jacob. Remember, he had a brother, Esau, a twin brother. But now the focus is on Jacob and then his 12 sons. And so we're going through the first few generations of the people of God, Abraham, then Isaac, and now we're on to Jacob and then his 12 sons. And it's a few notes about these 12, or about Jacob and his 12 sons. First of all, he has a dream, we see in chapter 28. And God again reasserts his promise that had been made to Abraham, but now it continues on to his descendants. And also, in addition, excuse me, we see Jacob go through a wrestling match with God there in chapter 33, verses 22 to 29. And there's a name change that Jacob undergoes from Jacob to Israel, which the word or the name Israel literally means strives with God, because he wrestled with God, because he longs for God to fulfill the promise, is what it ultimately is about. And Jacob's growing family is really part of that fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, because we're seeing, because Abraham had been told that he would be the father of a great nation. And in the 12 sons of Jacob's, we see the beginnings of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so now we come to a very specific. So yes, I want to highlight that. I didn't want you to overlook this little line about the 12 sons becoming the 12 tribes of Israel. So don't forget that part as well. Then moving on, we come to the last part of the book of Genesis, where the focus is on Joseph from chapters 37 through 50. And in these chapters, we see Joseph's life being something exemplary. His life is worth emulating or imitating, living up to. And in what ways is his worth imitating? Well, in how he handled temptation. Remember Potiphar's wife, how he responded to that. And also how he forgave his brothers who had betrayed him. Think of how he handled that as well. And essentially, his life explains how Israel ended up in Egypt, that is, Israel as a nation, and how they flourished there and not in Palestine. But now I want to back up a bit and just take you through some of the big themes of Genesis, because this is something that we need to really drill down on. First of all, there is only one God who created and valued humans. That's really important to get. Secondly, it explains what's wrong with the world, which is, in a word, sin. Third theme, election. I'm not talking about voting in December or in November. I'm talking about how God elects or chooses Israel to serve as his representative and instrument of salvation for the world. And that's what verses 2 and 3 really highlight in Genesis chapter 12. Fourthly, the nature of promise, namely God's promise to Abraham. And the thing is Abraham only sees a part of those promises fulfilled. He only sees partial fulfillment. Complete fulfillment comes in later generations. But here's the message. God's promises can be trusted, even if they take a while to be fulfilled. Lastly, I want to highlight the theme of covenant. That is a relationship initiated by God and what it means to live in relationship with God. It explains what God freely offers us, which is life and blessing. And it also explains what God expects of us, which is, in a word, obedience. That's what it comes down to. Now, I want to remind you that there are a couple of other videos I encourage you to watch in addition to this one. Those videos are in the red resource folder about an overview of our Pentateuch and also a closer look at what it means to interpret the Bible. All right, my friends, that is everything that I want to cover. And let me know, email me if you have any questions about what we've covered.